Okay.
This hangout.
I think we're on. I think we're live. So I'm Rick Rosenthal, and I directed Drones. And what we're going to try to do is field questions and have a lively discussion. But this technology is a little new for us, and in fact, it was only about 30 seconds ago that everybody is here, and we're not sure we'll be able to hear everybody. So we'll be back and forth a little bit. But what I'd like to do right now.
I don't think it's actually started yet. You're not. You're good.
What I'd like to do is ask the panel to introduce themselves. So why don't we start with Zeke?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Zeke Johnson. I'm the director of Amnesty International USA's Security and Human Rights Program. I'm based in New York. Pardis, off to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pardis Kebriai. I'm a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and my work on this was in challenging the U.S. government's drone killings of U.S. citizens, in particular, along with the ACLU.
All right, let's try to go to Noreen. We're not sure if her mic is working. Hopefully, it is, but let's find out. No. Noreen, I think we're going to have to come back to you because we're not hearing you. So I would double check. All right, well, why don't we, do we have the first question that's popped up, or should we talk amongst ourselves?
Why don't you talk amongst yourselves?
So maybe kick it off, Pardis, talking a little bit about, you know, how this film ties into your work and what it triggered off.
You know, I think one of the things the film demonstrated for me in terms of just, you know, the scenes about not knowing who the target was and the issues of civilian casualties, just for me, I think highlighted the importance of keeping the rules of international law that govern armed force limited and exceptional, so that we're not, you know, faced with those dilemmas more than we have to be. And I think part of the problem with the U.S. government's targeted killing program is just the scope of it, the breadth of it, the worldwide nature of it. These killings, you know, we saw one example in this film of the dilemmas people face. War and armed force is inherently dangerous. There are inherent risks to civilians. There are inherent questions like the ones these operators faced. And this is a program that has been going on for years, since 2002, that spans not just zones of active hostilities like in Afghanistan, but in countries far outside of those battlefields like Yemen and Pakistan and Somalia. So I think the scope and the sort of never-ending nature of this program is part of what I was thinking about in watching the film.
Here's the first question that's come in, and maybe you guys can address this. How often does the U.S. kill civilians with drones? I mean, this is at the heart of what we're trying to get at, that I think the lack of transparency right now is so evident that it's really hard to answer that question. But I don't know, Zeke, maybe you can take a crack at that.
Absolutely. I mean, the drone strike program is so shrouded in secrecy, we really don't have a good idea about how many people have been killed, let alone the number of civilians or the number of children who've been killed. The Obama administration has kept this program almost completely under wraps. And that's just not okay. We're talking about killing people around the world. I mean, imagine for a second if Iran or North Korea was going around killing people with drones in the US and Europe. We would demand answers. We'd want to know what's happening. We'd want to know on what basis the government is claiming to be able to do this. And we'd want to see accountability for anyone who's killed illegally. But somehow people seem to accept that it's just okay because it's our government doing it. And that's not right. I mean, that's what human rights are all about, having one standard for all people, for all governments around the world. And every government's got to follow that. So that's what we're out here saying. You know, follow the law, follow human rights, make sure that you're not killing more people.
I can just add to that, I think the secrecy around the program is an ongoing problem. The administration has said it is the most transparent administration ever. It is absolutely not. There are many questions we still have. I do want to point out that, in this void, non-governmental sources have really stepped up. There are journalists. There's a Bureau of Investigative Journalism is an incredible source for the data that does exist. There are no official data that exists, but there are non-governmental sources, and those sources are credible. They range. There are sort of more conservative estimates and there are higher estimates, but they all sort of agree that at a minimum, over 2,000 to 3,000 people have been killed, and at the high end, over 4,000 people have been killed. So that data, I think, is important to recognize. We need the government's numbers. We need their data, but there are other numbers and other reporting that has happened, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. There are thousands of people who have been killed in this program. The United States government, as Zeke was saying, in terms of secrecy, has acknowledged exactly four of those deaths. They have acknowledged the killings of 4 U.S. citizens. There are thousands of other people whose deaths they have absolutely not acknowledged and certainly not given any facts about.
Now, as a follow-up question, it's been asked, how is this legal? Well, we've covered that a little bit, but the question is, how can ordinary citizens stop this? And, our film actually initiated a petition demanding transparency that's housed at where's our house?
Credo.
At Credo, credo.com, right? So,
Credo.
or is it credo.org? We better know. We'll post it at the end here. Noreen, it sounds like your mic is live now, so whenever you're ready to weigh in, we would welcome.
Introduce yourself as well.
Maybe by introducing yourself first, and then maybe we cover how we think ordinary citizens can get involved.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Noreen?
I think we lost Noreen. She may be coming back. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about how we can, as ordinary citizens, what are some possible steps to get involved?
Absolutely. I mean, Amnesty International is all about citizen activism, and we provide a platform so regular people can come together and use the power of collective action to change governments. And basically, when it comes to drone strikes, there's 3 sort of big areas we're asking for change around. One is more transparency from the administration about who it's killing and why and under what legal authority. The second is reform of the U.S. government's approach to law and policy here. Over the years, the government has claimed essentially that the world is a battlefield. And that it can use lethal force around the world under the law of war, and that's okay. But that's a real problem because the law of war is more permissible than regular standard human rights law. And so if the government's going around saying the world is a battlefield, that means it's killing more people than it should. The third area that we want to talk about is accountability. There need to be full investigations of strikes that some people think are illegal. If anyone's broken the law, there have to be prosecutions, and victims have to have justice. So for Amnesty, you can go to our website and go to amnestyusa.org/drones. And the first thing you can do there is take a petition, sign a petition to the U.S. government, to President Obama and Congress about those 3 things: transparency, reform, and accountability. And if you want to get more involved with us, you can take part in our lobbying efforts. We're pushing Congress to try to pass legislation that would require the administration to disclose more information about drone strikes. And President Obama is fighting this. He's directly called out Congress saying, don't pass this legislation. But we're banding together, we're going out in the streets, we're contacting members of Congress, urging them to stand tall and say, hey, we need to know what's going on here. So definitely go to amnestyusa.org/drones if you want to get involved.
Great. Noreen, can you introduce yourself and maybe follow up, because I think we've got you finally.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Hi, I'm Noreen Shah. I'm Legislative Counsel on Human Rights with the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm based in D.C., and I'm one of our lobbyists who's focusing on trying to get Congress and the administration to make real changes to our policy on U.S. drone strikes and other national security issues. I think I missed, actually, the question that was posed to Zeke that he was answering, but I'll take a stab at another one.
Actually, the question that was asked was, how can ordinary citizens, how how can they stop drone strikes?
Well, for the ACLU, I think the issue is whether or not the U.S. is conducting drone strikes in a way that's lawful and transparent. And one of the issues that we've raised is why the U.S. government is continuing to withhold vital information about the way these drone strikes are being conducted, who's being killed, and what the legal standards are that the administration is using. One of the main problems is that it's the CIA that's running a lot of these drone strikes. So what we're doing right now is asking Congress to pass a law that would consolidate drone strikes in the U.S. military and take them out of the hands of the CIA so that drone strikes could be more transparent. And it's vital that everyone out there be contacting their members of Congress to get them to support this bill, which is called the Drone Reform Act. It was introduced just a couple of weeks ago by Representative Yoho.
So there's a question about will there be other opportunities to watch the film? The film is now on VOD, and it's playing around the country on different cable providers, but it's definitely on iTunes, and so that's a surefire way to take a look at the film. It's on also in Redbox. Here's a question that comes in: do drone killings comply with international law? Who wants to take that one?
I can try to do that. You know, the starting point of whether there's compliance or not is whether these drone strikes are occurring within zones of armed conflict or outside of zones of armed conflict. Depending on the context, the rules that govern the use of force and that govern killing change. Our primary problem, CCR's primary problem with the drone killing program is the use of armed force and the use of the laws of war, which are sort of exceptional rules that are meant to be limited to exceptional situations of war, using those laws more broadly outside of actual battlefields, outside of actual zones of active hostilities and fighting. And in our view, that is sort of the legal problem. So drone killings that are happening in Yemen, which, for example, where there have been dozens of strikes and hundreds of people killed, including civilians, in our view, are outside of a situation of armed conflict. There is both requirements of, the requirement of having organized armed groups and a certain intensity of fighting, and also a geographic limitation to armed conflict. So the use of drones in a place like Yemen, for example, the use of the laws of war in a place like Yemen, in our view, sort of fundamentally, I think, raises serious questions about the U.S.'s compliance with international law. Outside of situations of armed conflict, the rules that govern killing and the use of force are ordinary international human rights law. When it has to do with the U.S. killing people, it's the U.S. Constitution. And those rules say that the United States cannot kill someone without due process, without criminal process, and the narrow exception to that rule is when there is an imminent threat of a specific and imminent threat, and lethal force is a last resort. That does not appear to be the standard that the United States is using outside of situations of actual battlefields.
I find personally the rules of war are so they're almost like an oxymoron. I mean, how can you have rules of war in the sense that you have this, you have conflict and people killing each other, which already seems against the rules of human nature. So I think the issue is so complicated.
But the fact is that the U.S. does know those rules exist, and what it wants to be able to do is in other conflicts, when it comes to other countries, it wants to be able to say, hey, you need to follow the rules, the laws of war. You need to tell us who you're killing. You need to investigate civilian casualties. And when instead it takes a position with regard to its own strikes that it doesn't have to provide this information, the kind of information it would ask of any other country, it sets not only a bad example, but it's undermining the entire system. It's undermining U.S. credibility around the world. It's setting a terrible precedent that somehow the use of drone technology makes it so you're excused from following the rules that have existed for a long time that everyone knows have to be followed.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely. And just piggybacking on that, it's not just about drones, right? I mean, the U.S. kills people in Afghanistan all the time, and it's not just with drones, with regular arms. We're coming out with a report very soon in a couple weeks about the killing of civilians in Afghanistan with any types of weapons, and it's a huge problem across the board. It's not just with drones. We've seen killings of civilians without proper investigations as required by the law of war. As Noreen said, the United States knows those rules, and the United States requires that other countries follow those rules. And not just with respect to drones. The U.S. government, every year puts out a report on the state of the world's human rights by other countries. It evaluates other countries on torture, on extrajudicial executions, on detention policy, and calls out governments for failing to meet their human rights obligations. That's great, but at the same time, the problem is that the U.S. government itself isn't meeting those same standards. You've got Guantanamo. You've got impunity for the CIA torture program. You've got impunity for the drone program. So it's really a deep problem, and at the core, it's all about hypocrisy. It's about not wanting to follow the rules that we help put in place and that we require of others to follow. And that's just not okay. We should demand more of our government. Our government should be setting an example, not breaking the rules.
so do you think it's possible to have a foreign policy in which America uses force to defend itself from terrorist threats that proscribe to the rules of war?
It's absolutely possible. I mean, the idea that we should be using force in a rule-bound way, that we have to follow these rules, that we train our military lawyers, we train our...
Oh, Noreen, we lost you for a second.
No, I think we've lost you. So you might have to reboot again, unfortunately.
I'll try to help to sort of fill the space for Noreen. I mean, look at it this way. If a gunman goes into a mall and starts shooting people, right? And the only way the police can stop that person from shooting people is to use lethal force as a last resort. From a human rights perspective, that can be justified, right? So I think for most human rights organizations, we're not saying you can never use lethal force. What we're saying is it has to be in extremely limited circumstances, right? As a last resort if you're not in an armed conflict. If you're in an armed conflict, you've got to follow the rules of war. So I think that's the standard. I think it's important to have philosophical and ethical debates about whether killing should ever be allowed. I think that's very important. But human rights do allow for the use of lethal force in very exceptional circumstances. And so that's sort of the rule that we're talking about.
I also thought that there was a moment in 2008 when there was a chance to reset American foreign policy and to have more transparency and to maybe re-examine how American foreign policy uses force. And instead, I think we sort of followed a course that had been set previously by prior administrations.
I mean, on that point, absolutely. I think the drone killing program is absolutely a continuation of a program that was started by Bush, a policy position that was taken by Bush, an interpretation of the law that was taken under the Bush administration, and an absolute continuation of that and an escalation of it in terms of the number of strikes and the number of killings. The premise of this program is one that has existed since 9/11, which is essentially that the United States can use armed force, can use armed military force potentially anywhere in the world, that the laws of war are not actually limited to actual war zones, that they have potentially global application. And that premise is one that underlies drone killings, it underlines detentions at Guantanamo and in other U.S. prisons abroad. And that is really the premise that we need to dismantle and just do away with now in the year 2014, over a decade since 9/11.
And I mean, let's be clear. I mean, we're all against terrorism. I mean, no one here is saying, oh, armed groups should be able to go around killing people. And we're all for accountability for 9/11. But that's not the issue here. Right? The issue is, how do we counter terrorism? Do we do it through the rule of law and the human rights framework, or do we do it by violating the rule of law and human rights framework. I mean, I know which world I'd rather live in. I'd rather live in a world where the U.S. government is following the rules and building a safer, more peaceful world for all of us. So I think that's the choice in front of us. It's not whether or not we counter terrorism, it's whether we counter terrorism the right way or the wrong way.
Yeah,
I think it's
one of the
also
questions
about...
Oh, go ahead.
Just the point about precedent, which I think either Noreen or Zeke brought up, I think to the extent that this program seems like a good idea to people in the United States right now because it makes us feel safer, or because you think there are dangerous terrorists who are being targeted, think about if the tables were turned and there are other countries claiming the same authority to be able to fly drones into U.S. airspace or other countries to target their citizens or foreign citizens that they have unilaterally decided on their own without any kind of review that those people are a threat. So I think it's really important to think about how we would feel if other countries were claiming this license. And this is a reality, in terms of countries that have actually used armed drones so far. It's the United States, the UK, and Israel. But there are at least a dozen other countries, or nearly that many, that are acquiring or developing armed drones, and there are dozens more that have drones in some form. So we are not far from a reality where other countries could very well be claiming the same authority, and I think that scenario is a really scary one that I think people need to think about.
Well, not only are there countries involved, but individuals now. I mean, the ability for an ordinary citizen to buy a drone and outfit it however he or she wants to outfit it, I think is really scary. And you're reading constantly now about drones showing up with no nationality attached, and nobody knows where they're coming from.
Noreen, are you back? Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
No.
No?
That's sad.
Hello?
We need to hear from Noreen.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, well, I mean, just piggybacking on your point, I mean, I think that's right. It is scary. But I think there's an even scarier sort of scenario on the horizon, which is that the U.S. and other governments are basically working on creating Terminators. Just like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie, eventually we're going to have machines that go around and decide on their own who to kill. And this is something that I think personally we need to put some effort into thinking about before we go down that path. And so Amnesty has joined other organizations in calling for a global moratorium on the development of those future robotic weapons, so that we as a species can think really seriously about whether or not we want to grant machines that potential power. So there's a lot of layers to this, and we're sort of just at the tip of the iceberg. And so I really encourage people to, pick up this book called Wired for War by Peter Singer that talks about future weapons like this, and really think through ethically what kind of world do we want in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and work back from there and figure out what we need to do now in order to make sure that we have the world we want.
Hello?
That's a fascinating book, and actually I was about to jump in to mention that book, but you did, and it's pretty difficult to read that book and not imagine how this world is changing, and some of these issues of morality are very, very, very complex.
Absolutely.
And I think in terms of harm, I mean, one of the things that I think the film tries to point out is that the harm, there's an imbalance. Certainly the people being killed are outside of the United States. They're in foreign countries, and we don't see them. We don't see that harm. But there is also harm that is happening here in the United States among people who are tasked with carrying out these operations, drone operators themselves. And I think in recent months, there are just a few people who have started speaking out, and I think it is really important to think about, to learn about, pay attention to their stories and the psychological harm that happens from, following a target for days or weeks, and then watching on a video feed, watching them blow up, and having serious questions about who they are, whether that killing was ethical, lawful, what civilians may have killed, and just the psychological impact and trauma of that. So I think there's harm on this side, domestically as well, and I think that's just starting to come out.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I just wanted to add that, yeah, one of the things I found most disturbing about the film and that I'm most worried about other countries picking up, I completely agree about the proliferation of drone technology, the proliferation of autonomous weapon systems being a major problem. But even more frightening to me is the idea that countries will pick up this slippage and continue to go between talking about militants who can be killed, directly targeted, killed almost with rules not applying, and civilians or people who shouldn't be killed with, generally. And what the film depicts really well, I think, is that people who could be unidentified or people who are military-age males could be discussed as being militants. And of course, militants is not even a legal term. Under the laws of war, if you're going to be directly targeted in a lawful way, you might be a combatant or you might be a civilian who's directly participating in hostilities, but it's a complicated question. It's not as simple as saying, look, there's a guy, he's carrying a weapon, especially in a region where a lot of people carry weapons. Oh, he must be a militant, he must be somebody we can kill, or he's the cousin of a person who we're trying to kill, so we can kill that person too. The most dangerous thing is that not just in the drone strikes or other conflicts, but conflicts around the world, this idea that somehow it's just presumptively okay to kill people because you believe that they are militants or they're associated with militants, that's one of the most dangerous things I can think of. And we see it all over the place, and it's completely contrary to not only international human rights law, but also the laws of war. Even U.S. military manuals that say that unless you positively ID somebody as a combatant, you have to presume that they're a civilian. And of course, if they're civilian, they can't be directly targeted. So some great scenes in the movie focused on that.
Question is coming about the definition of terrorism. What is terrorism? Who does it? Who comes up with the definition that makes it a definition we all understand?
I'll jump in. I mean, there's no accepted definition in international law of terrorism. But I think what we're talking about here is the idea of an armed group that's deliberately targeting civilians, such as in the 9/11 attacks. And I think the point is well taken. If a state deliberately targets civilians, that too can be quote-unquote terrorism. I mean, the issue here isn't so much the definition of the words that we're using, but rather the legal and human rights standards that apply to states and to armed groups. And what we're saying here is that, yes, armed groups are violating these rights, but as a result, the U.S. government doesn't have a right to violate the rule of law and human rights in return. The U.S. government has to uphold human rights and the rule of law as it seeks to counter armed groups. And I think that's the basic point that human rights organizations are making.
And an adjunct question to that, I think, comes in here is the inherent use of drones intrinsically connected to the flat international law. In other words, are there circumstances under which the use of drones is justified in the international opinion?
I think certainly. Go ahead, Noreen. It's good to hear your voice.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's a real mistake to focus in this case on the weapons platform. It's really about the way the U.S. government is deciding to use drone technology. And, all uses of force raise profound ethical and moral questions, and also raise legal questions. But not every use of force with the use of drones is going to be inherently unlawful. It's not as though this is a weapon system that is inherently can't discriminate between civilians and combatants or can't be used in a way that complies with international human rights law. But we have to avoid those kinds of arguments because those are the kinds that will be distorted by people who don't really want to answer basic questions about what the U.S. is doing with drone strikes. If we're using drones in a way to evade accountability for who's being killed, to evade questions about how we're using force and under what rules, then of course we're going to have a problem with the use of drones. But it's not really about the drone system itself. It's about why the U.S. government is using it in this way and whether or not it's taking drone technology as an excuse to not do the things that it knows it needs to be doing.
I agree with that. I mean, I think the focus is really on the law that's being distorted and sort of expanded and the policy and less on the weapon. I think the things to think about with the use of drones have more to do with the implications for the ease of killing, the expansion of war, the lack of accountability, the asymmetric nature of warfare and sort of killing people remotely and not seeing the harm and the implications for that and just perpetual warfare and violence. I do think outside of situations of armed conflict, there's a serious question. Just inherently, the nature of drones, I think, make it very difficult to comply with the laws outside of situations of armed conflict, which require very strict imminence in terms of the nature of the threat and that lethal force be used as the last resort. And I think just inherently that technology presents a real challenge in complying with those standards.
You also have just one point, that the Obama administration has actually put into place rules that it says it will follow when it uses force outside of what it calls a recognized zone of recognized battlefield. And those rules include that it's not going to use force when it's possible and it's feasible to capture an individual. But when we use drones and we're using drones to use lethal force, there is no possibility of capture. You're either killing the person or you're not killing the person. And so that raises real questions. If the U.S. is continuing to rely on drone technology and doing that as a way of doing business, then how can it comply with its own rules and rules under international law that it capture when it's feasible and that it only use lethal force as a last resort?
Well, don't you think also one of the issues has to do with the fact that the use of drones enables a country to use force without putting troops in harm's way? So, the pilots who are flying the drones are never at risk. And so, to a degree, sometimes I feel like the intelligence that we're relying on we're not always able to vet it, and because there's no risk really to send drones in, we're sending drones in. And so, to a degree, the rules have been changed in a way that is abstract rather than finite.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, if you look at, so basically there's two legal paradigms here, right? One is if you're in an armed conflict, then you've got to follow the rules for the law of armed conflict. If you're not in an armed conflict, as Perdi's talked about, the only time you can use lethal force is to counter an imminent threat to life as a last resort. And for many years, the U.S. government accepted that imminent threat paradigm, right? But what we've seen with the rise of drones is the U.S. government trying to redefine what the word imminent means. And so basically they have this technology, they want to use it, and so what are they doing? They're trying to redefine the meaning of the words in the law. And so there is a sense in which the technology itself is driving distortions in the law, and I think the technology itself inherently, because of its attractiveness to governments, because you can basically kill people without risking your own lives, is driving this sort of desire to redefine and expand the parameters of when a state can kill. And to me, that's deeply disturbing, and that's not what our government should be doing with our tax dollars. So, again, I think we all have to really think hard about this, educate ourselves, and ask ourselves, is this the world that we want? Would we want some other government doing what the U.S. government is doing? Would we want Iran doing it? Would we want North Korea doing it? And I think the answer there is pretty obviously no.
There's a question about accountability and, how do we feel, ultimately, who is accountable for decision-making in the chain of command?
Well, ultimately, it's Obama. He's the commander-in-chief, right? Just to jump in there. So I think at the end of the day, he's the person who's responsible. And also, at the end of the day, we're responsible for holding our elected officials accountable to the law. So at the end, I think in a sense, at the end of the day, we're all accountable, each and every one of us, for these killings for Americans.
In terms of what accountability has looked like in the United States, I think there are different forms of it. There's accountability in terms of the courts and legal accountability. There's also just a basic accountability in terms of acknowledging what you are doing, acknowledging harm, acknowledging violations, and providing reparations for them and redressing them. And at that very basic level, in just acknowledging the deaths of children, of people abroad, that basic form of accountability, that most basic form of accountability, has not happened. As I said, non-governmental sources have reported that as many as over 4,000 people have been killed, and the United States government has acknowledged exactly 4 of those deaths officially for U.S. citizens. So that form of accountability is absolutely not happening. And then in terms of legal accountability and judicial accountability, unfortunately, challenges that have been brought in the United States have suffered the same fate of virtually every other case dealing with national security since 9/11, which is that they've been dismissed on threshold sort of jurisdictional grounds having to do with whether the courts can actually even review claims that constitutional rights and international human rights have been violated. And so far, virtually every case has been dismissed on those grounds, as was the CCR and ACLU cases challenging the killings of U.S. citizens. So in terms of legal and judicial accountability, that has also been absolutely absent in the United States.
So we're coming up on the half-hour time limit. Couple of things I wanted to say. We're happy to continue answering questions on Twitter. Also, dronesthefilm.com is where both the petition, the creative petition, and a discussion guide reside. Dronesthefilm.com, and we'd be happy to continue, but I think perhaps we should take one more question if it pops up. Otherwise, I'd love for you guys, if you have a final thought on both the film and the circumstances, it'd be great. Noreen, do you want to just sort of make a closing comment? Sort of go around and
sure.
Close.
I'm a little optimistic right now about the way things are going in terms of holding our government to account. As Pardee said, we've had a lot of problems bringing court cases. The U.S. government has tried to ignore and fail to answer a lot of our investigations and reports that are out there about drone strikes. But at the same time, I feel like we have them on the ropes. They know that public attention to this issue is increasing, that there's more and more documentation out there, and even in some of our litigation related to the Freedom of Information Act, they have been forced to provide more information about what their standards are. They were forced to provide a memo about what their legal basis was for drone strikes to us after years of litigation. And so we're getting more and more information about this, and we're getting, I think by doing that, we're really holding their feet to the fire. And that's the most important thing, that people who are operating drones, people who are making these decisions, know that they are being watched, that eventually they will be held accountable, and that the public is not indifferent, and that it's very aware. And I think that's where everybody who's watching this film comes in, whether or not it's through a letter to the editor or by giving a phone call to your member of Congress, letting them know that you're watching this movie and that you're concerned about the issues. That's tremendous, and that'll do a lot to just break the cycle of impunity for unlawful drone strikes.
Zeke, one last thought on the movie and maybe the set of circumstances that we find our country's foreign policy in?
Sure. I mean, I think it's just so important that we debate these issues, that we as citizens educate ourselves about what's happening. I mean, don't take our words for it. Read the information that's out in the public domain. I mean, Amnesty has reports about drone strikes, ACLU, CCR does. See what we have to say, see what you think, and if you want to get involved, join our organizations. For Amnesty, go to amnestyusa.org/drones. You can take action right there, read our reports, watch our videos, and get involved. This is our country. We have a voice. We have a responsibility to make sure that our tax dollars are being used in a way that aligns with our values and our ethics.
Thank you. Pardis?
Just in terms of thoughts about the film, I think part of what's so critical about it is that it has been largely a covert program. I think the film gives some insight into harm on one side. That's been part of the challenge, is just understanding the harm of this program and the impact of it on people on both sides. So I think this film is really important in that sense. And I would also just say what Zeke said, which is learn more. You know, if you want to know what you can do, I think you can. The most basic thing to start with is just getting more of the facts, learning more about what this program is, learning more about the impact. You can go to the websites of any of our organizations, CCR, and read about the killings of U.S. citizens, the ACLU, and read about the litigation brought in terms of transparency, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and read about fact-finding reports in Pakistan and Yemen. And if you're bothered by what you're reading, do something about it. At a minimum, tell a friend about it. Share this film with your neighbor, with your friend. I think that's just sort of the most basic action that we can each take is educating ourselves about what is being done in our name.
Great. I think one last thing, you know, we haven't talked at all about PTSD and how that's really radically changed with the drones program in a way that I don't think anyone's anticipated. And that's a completely different subject, but one that I think also is going to need more and more attention as our military, I think, is going to begin to rely more and more on unmanned flights, even though they are in fact manned by pilots back in the U.S. So PTSD, I think, is a big issue that also is something we're going to have to face. I did want to put this up. This is, I don't know if this will work here, but this is where our petition lies. I think you can, hopefully you can read that. I'll just hold up here for a moment. And then last but not least, I want to hold up our website. So this is a high-tech and low-tech here. And so I'm just going to hold that up for a moment, dronesfilm.com. And as I say, we're happy to continue conversations on Twitter. And thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, panelists, for really having a lively and important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for putting this film together.
Thanks. All right, thank you.